Hi, welcome. I'm Kelly Circo. I work here in the archives. Some of you may not know me, but I'm just here to introduce Krista Castillo from Fort Negley. She's the museum coordinator over there, and she's doing a presentation today on women in war, a brief summary of the contributions of American women on the home front during the Civil War and the First World War. So, yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Metro Archives and Ken Feith for the opportunity to speak to you today. And as Kelly said, today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the roles of women during the Civil War and the First World War. And as the title of the presentation states, this is just a very brief summary of those roles. There's really only so much you can do in 45 minutes or so. And I do have to, watch my time because I do have a tendency to talk and talk. So whenever you need to cut me off, just let me know. So just 53 years separated the end of the American Civil War and the United States entrance into the First World War. And although the nation was undergoing a multitude of changes during that time, including expanding opportunities for women, one glaring fact remained, and that is that women were still politically voiceless. Today we tend to think of women as being, women living in the late 19th century, early 20th century, as being powerless, but the artwork produced during the Civil War and the First World War reveal how much influence women really had on politics, society, and war long before the passage of the 19th Amendment. This first image is one of the earliest depictions targeting a particular group of women. This is a sketch from Harper's Weekly in 1861, and it is portraying the way women in secessionist communities would often alter their dress to align with their political views. And Baltimore and Nashville were wonderful examples of this. Nashville especially because it was occupied by federal troops early in the war. It was a Confederate capital. And although women were kind of stuck between voicing their views and the chaste norms of Victorian society, they took every opportunity they could to make their distaste for the enemy's presence known. Some women would go indoors as soldiers passed by. Others would put their skirts over their faces. Not really sure how the soldiers felt about that. They probably didn't mind too much. But for the women, that was a huge insult. A federal soldier, Henry Erisman, and Elvira Powers, a nurse from New England, described women in Nashville wearing secessionist flags as aprons, as depicted in this sketch, and carrying pistols in the waistbands for the purpose of shooting Yankees. So they were not shy about voicing their opinions. For military authorities who came to Nashville, they were completely unprepared for the number of women suddenly under their control. And this unpreparedness is really demonstrated during the war. They are very inconsistent. At times, military officials would not allow women to leave the city or enter the city. Then at other times, when it served military purposes, women were allowed to nurse Confederate wounded, leave the city to nurse relatives on southern battlefields. The military quickly learned that women could take some of the pressure off of the military. Another phenomenon that military officials were not prepared for was the huge influx of refugees into occupied territories. And artists during this time often used depictions of women to spotlight some of the injustices and suffering that war created. During the early days of the war, Unionists sought shelter in territories occupied by Union armies. Confederates fled farther south. And also there was an influx of just civilians of every walk of life flooding into cities and towns, trying to escape advancing armies of both sides. When refugees began arriving in Nashville in 1862, private citizens and newspaper editors appealed for donations. They were in need of food, blankets, clothing, medical supplies, firewood, and other necessities. Most refugees that came into Nashville had only the clothing on their backs. By 1864, the Nashville Refugee Aid Society was formed for the purposes of assisting refugees. There was a refugee asylum founded on Broad Street, which is now Broadway. And although it offered some relief, most refugees were still living out in the open, mainly at railroad depots, exposed to the weather and the elements. Newspapers at the time revealed just what an issue refugees were for civilians and the military, to the point that newspaper reports offer daily totals of arrivals and departures. And on June 2nd, 1865, the New York Times reported that government undertaker W.R. Cornelius buried approximately 10,000 refugees in Nashville. African Americans, labeled contrabands, represent another class of people created by the chaos of war. These runaway slaves came to Union-occupied territories in search of protection and freedom, and often what they found was starvation, disease, racism. At many times the Army exploited this very vulnerable population. One of those examples is the fortifications, including Fort Negley, that were built around Nashville throughout the occupation. Treatment of women and children, refugees, really depended on the military leadership. And it also depended on the overall military goals at the time. It wasn't until 1864 that formal contraband camps were established in Nashville. Although thousands lived in these camps, most did not. They occupied really any place they could find shelter, and many areas without shelter. A large contraband camp was formed between Fort Negley and Franklin Pike, and that area would later evolve into what was known as Rocktown prior to the 1930s. By August 1863, the Army employed approximately 11,000 African American laborers in Middle Tennessee. And again, as with women, the military started to see the benefits that African American laborers offered. They served as cooks, clerks, masons, messengers, laundresses. So they freed up soldiers for more military jobs. The military throughout the occupation was questioned about who was responsible for the growing number of contrabands, like refugees. The Freedmen's Bureau did provide some relief, but largely escaped slaves and free African Americans were left destitute. Military Governor Andrew Johnson largely ignored recommendations to aid contrabands, arguing that whites would resent, hate, and persecute African Americans for receiving special privileges like education and medicine. By July 1865, there were established camps across Tennessee, and it was reported that 7,151 African Americans were living in those camps. By August, the number of African Americans living in places other than established camps within Nashville reached 10,744. Artists such as Thomas Nast also used representations of women to describe the suffering that women on both sides of the war were experiencing. And here's a very famous sketch from New Year's Day, 1864, where he is contrasting the wealth and security of a northern family to the destitution and sorrow of a southern family. The Civil War offered women, North and South, new employment opportunities. In addition to filling voids left by men in fields, factories, markets, and shops, new occupations that were traditionally male were also opened up to women, such as in classrooms, hospitals, and government offices. For the first time, professions closed to women during peacetime were available. In Nashville, the U.S. quartermaster employed 200 refugees, mostly women, at good wages, repairing tents. African American women worked as laborers, cooks, laundresses, and nurses. Most women in Nashville and other areas of the South generally eked out a living as best they could, taking employment where they could find it. Some were forced into a life of prostitution by no other choice of their own. And an extensive study conducted by Thomas Lowry, MD, revealed that while elegant bordellos existed in Nashville, the majority of prostitutes lived in one-room, little apartments, usually with their children. They lived in abject poverty. Most had lost a husband in the war and had no other means for providing for themselves and their families. As you can imagine, venereal disease was a huge problem in Nashville, and after many failed attempts to root out prostitution, the military embraced it and began licensing prostitutes to operate. And the fees from those licenses supported a hospital dedicated to prostitutes. Volunteers, charity workers, and camp followers also filled much needed roles during the Civil War. In the fall of 1863, the St. Louis Union Aid Society came to Nashville, where they established a special dietary kitchen. And in August 1864, this kitchen served 62,000 dishes largely furnished by the Pittsburgh Sustenance Committee. So that gives you an idea of just how many people were in Nashville at that time. One of the most fascinating post-war memoirs was written by Elvira Powers. It's called Hospital Pencilings. She was a nurse from, I believe, Massachusetts, and she split her time between Jefferson General Hospital in Jefferson, Indiana, and Nashville. And I'd just like to read to you a passage that really encapsulates the hardships that she experienced as a charity worker. Quote, "Please imagine, dear friends, you humble servant as sitting down to a long table with some 18 others, not tables, but ladies, and viewing 3 plates of bread, 3 bowls of gravy, ditto of applesauce arranged at equal distances, and that each has the exquisite pleasure of chewing for a reasonable length of time a piece of tough meat, which is strongly suspected of having once been the person of a mule." Like civilian aid workers, camp followers also filled an important void within the military structure. They provided cooking, cleaning, medical, and other domestic services. This is another issue that military officials had to address. This influx of women and children into military camps. Officers who occupied vacant houses often encouraged their families to come join them in the city. While in some ways they taxed the Army, which would have been responsible for providing accommodations and sustenance, they also took care of laundry, cooking, and cleaning. Another interesting thing that camp followers did was keep men in Civil War armies in line, including the mother of General Robert S. Granger, who was the post commander in 1863. His mother followed him throughout the war and actually confronted General Dodge for allowing his men to forage, and General Sherman for sweeping necessities like clothing, shoes, and food out of Middle Tennessee. I don't think you would make it to the rank of general today with your mother following you around. During this time, women also served as powerful representations of victory and peace. Very idealized illustrations, and those are used throughout the war. And we will see much more of that as we progress into the 20th century. I actually just added this part today because I'm always asked about women serving in the Civil War Army. And for some reason, I never thought to include it before. During the Civil War, military service was not open to women, and impersonating a man was a punishable offense. You could actually serve time in prison. Although that was the case, many women, and we may never know the accurate numbers, served in both armies. Recent scholarship suggests that between 400 and 750 women served, disguised as men. And for generations, historians treated these women as anomalies. But this recent scholarship has revealed that women were motivated by the same factors as men: duty, honor, opportunity, adventure, empowerment. And just a few examples of women who came through the Nashville area are Sarah E. Bradbury. She was born in Wilson County. She served with the 7th Illinois Cavalry with her bow. And during her time in the military, she did have several boyfriends. Lizzie Compton, who was born near Nashville, enlisted in the Union Army at age 14, and during an 18-month period, she served in 7 regiments, fought at Mill Springs, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh, and received wounds at Gettysburg. 18-year-old Irish immigrant Jenny Hodgers may have used the war as an opportunity to claim her true identity. As Albert D. J. Cashiers, she enlisted in Company G of the 95th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. She served throughout the entire existence of that regiment. She fought at Vicksburg and Nashville without ever revealing her identity. And she lived the rest of her life as a man, dying in 1915. So at the end of the war, although women were expected to pretty much pick up and return to the lives they had known, they were faced with new challenges. In the South especially, they had diminished marital prospects, with 25% or so of the young eligible men killed in war. They didn't have many options. Women were also faced with the return of husbands, brothers, sons who were physically and mentally wounded, some to the point of not being able to care for themselves or the family anymore. And widows faced the prospect of starting over alone, most often with children. So now we'll fast forward to the late 1900s. After the war, the United States was experiencing a period of rapid urbanization, industrialization, waves of immigrants flooded into the country. Cities became crowded slums. There were high rates of disease and infant mortality. There was corruption at all levels of government and rampant corporate greed. The Progressive era, which was is considered between the 1890s and the 1920s, ushered in a period of reform as citizens demanded better living and working conditions for the working class, environmental conservation, improved public health, sanitation, and education, and the elimination of government waste and corruption. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, it triggered a huge demand for war materials in the United States, which helped to bring on the Great Migration. So between 1914 and 1920, approximately 500,000 Southern African Americans moved north in search of better opportunities. Most often, what they found was the same prejudice that they had experienced in the South. But by and large, their labor was much needed in the North. And although World War I was not America's first experience with fighting on a foreign soil, it was the world's first experience with war on such a massive scale. Americans faced the challenges of shipping nearly 5 million men and supplies overseas. And at the time, the population of the United States was around 99 million. The home front braced for the realities of 5 million fewer men in the fields, factories, and on the docks. And while mobilizing women during the Progressive era proved less challenging than during the Civil War, many Americans still needed convincing. And war on such a large scale, it's no surprise that it would usher in the first propaganda campaign that was seen across all belligerents. Artists like James Montgomery Flagg, most famous for his depiction of Uncle Sam, used personifications of America and women resembling goddesses and angels to stir people to action. Other propaganda posters targeted women for their devotion to family and through their role in society as caregivers. Again, American women were politically voiceless, but they found themselves called into service. At the start of World War I, Americans were very divided. And many politically active groups took to the streets with their beliefs. Those in favor of peace actively protested the war, while others embraced the image of patriotic mother and the notion that citizenship demands service of men and women during war. Shooting clubs and paramilitary groups targeting women sprung up across the country, and these groups adopted military uniforms and drills. But for a moment, I just want to talk about the peace organizations. For the first time, female-led peace organizations participated in international conferences. In 1915, Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman Carr summoned together a conference of 3,000 women in Washington, D.C. to call for peace, the limitation of armaments, nationalization of weapons manufacture, opposition to militarism in culture and government, and economic sources of conflict. And that year, 1,200 women from across the world gathered at The Hague to study and make known and eliminate the causes of war. By 1917, that organization, which would eventually be known as the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, boasted 40,000 members. And according to their website, they directly influenced 9 of President Wilson's 14 points. The organization is still in existence today, and it promotes disarmament and human rights around the world. Due to the well-established women's organizations flourishing in America since the 1890s, women already had the apparatus in place and the know-how to effect real change. Between 1914 and 1917, these groups gathered donations for destitute European civilians. And when the U.S. entered the war in 1918, they shifted their focus to knitting and sewing for American soldiers. The military gladly accepted the donation of free supplies and free labor. Under pressure from President Wilson's administration and the leadership of women's groups, hundreds of thousands of women on the home front and overseas volunteered with organizations such as the YMCA, the Red Cross, the American Library Association, and others. Committees and councils led by women at the national, state, and local levels organized under larger umbrella organizations, and they strove for better efficiency and communication. And for the first time, women were realizing on a massive scale that their efforts were needed and they were not willing to be exploited. One of the strongest advocates for mobilizing women was Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And in 1918, she published an extensive study on her time in Europe observing the roles women played during war. She called her book Mobilizing Woman Power, and it was a rousing call to American women to work and to American men to allow them. And President Theodore Roosevelt echoed these sentiments in the foreword. Quote, "I join with her in the appeal that the women shall back the men with service, and that the men in their turn shall frankly and eagerly welcome the rendering of such service on the basis of service by equals with equals for a common end." She offered detailed descriptions of her time in England and France in 1915, where she observed women employed in food production, law enforcement, transportation, finance, communication, manufacturing, emergency medical care, and commerce. And to her surprise, she found women, quote, "happy in their work, happy in the thought of rendering service, so happy that the poignancy of individual loss was carried more easily," end quote. She hoped that practicality would translate to the United States, which it did on a government level. Unfortunately, Americans as a whole were still maintaining this willing blindness to serious labor shortages. But endorsed by former President Theodore Roosevelt, many of her ideas were adopted by the US government. Although only 3% of the population served in the military, a labor shortage threatened not only manufacturing of war material, but also the nation's ability to feed people at home and abroad. Much of Europe's population depended on American agriculture. So Blatch offered the Women's Land Army as a solution. It was inaugurated in England. And I'll quote Ms. Blatch, "The war may furnish the spark for needed revolution. Manpower is not available. Woman power is at hand. A new labor force always brings ideas and ideals particular to itself. May not women, as fresh recruits in a land army, stamp their likes and dislikes on farm life? Their enthusiasm may put staleness to rout, and the group system of women land workers already tested in the crucible of experience may bring to the farm the antidote to isolation," end quote. The government embraced the Women's Land Army, and from 1917 to 1919, 20,000 farmettes plowed, planted, and harvested. The first experiment with farmettes was conducted on the 740-acre farm at Vassar College in New York, where they employed 12 town-bred college girls. During that spring and summer, the girls worked at 17.5 cents an hour, 2.5 cents less than their male counterparts. But by the end of the summer, the male laborers were so impressed by the girls that they insisted that they receive equal pay. Farmers also embraced this idea and came to request farmettes. One farmer, George T. Powell, owner of Orchard Farm in Ghent, New York, wrote, "We know that in but 10 minutes of instruction given in the use of a hoe in the culture of corn, beans, potatoes, in field or garden crops, girls of training have very soon done more or better work than many farm laborers who are paid higher wages than they are worth. While many men will drop the tool the moment the time has come to quit, during the past year, college girls are known to have finished 10 or 20 more feet of rows in hoeing before they would leave their work in an unfinished condition." And soon, similar arrangements with farmettes sprang up across the country. As I said earlier, women had the opportunity to enter into new occupations once reserved for men. Women were no longer limited to work with textiles. They could take jobs in heavy industries as clerks or as secretaries. Even prior to the U.S. entries into World War I, more than 3 million women entered the workforce for the first time. And America's entry into the war in 1918 offered women opportunities in automobile and aircraft manufacture. And for the first time, women could take jobs as law enforcement officers, mechanics, and train conductors. Harriet Stanton Blatch, again, stressed the importance of female workers. "War compels women to work. That is one of its merits. Women are forced to use body and mind. They cannot be idlers. Perhaps that is the reason military nations hold sway so long. Their reign continues not because they draw strength from the conquered nation, but because their women are roused to exertion. Active mothers ensure a virile race." Although the struggle for equal rights continued for several decades and would continue far into the future, women in World War I gained leverage on several key issues. In 1918, they gained representation among the National Women's Trade League of America, which served on national, state, and local committees appointed by the Council of National Defense. The Women in Industry Service, created by the U.S. Labor Department, labored for the 10-hour workday, exemptions for mothers with young children, higher safety standards, and levels of pay equal with their male counterparts. Women also participated in strikes, and they joined unions. In addition, and probably most importantly to most husbands, they proved themselves able to care for home, family, finance, and children in their husband's absence. Medical services took many forms during World War I. Nearly 200 women served as doctors at home and abroad under the auspices of charitable organizations and the U.S. military. More than 21,480 women served in the Army Nurses Corps, and 10,660 of those risked their lives on front lines with American Expeditionary Forces. The American Red Cross offered volunteer opportunities, and women, mostly untrained, flocked to the organization. By that point, although the Red Cross was founded by Clara Barton during the Civil War, all of the leadership roles were held by men. And World War I was able to reverse that and put more women back in charge. In 1914, 107 local chapters boasted 17,000 members. By 1918, 20 million adults and 11 million children were members of the American Red Cross. The Red Cross swelled to more than 3,800 chapters, and Americans contributed $400 million in funds and materials to support Red Cross programming. In 1914, relief efforts primarily focused on supplying surgical dressings, and clothing to foreign refugees. But by 1917, calls for American men into service accelerated the urgency. In participation with Allied military forces, the Red Cross staffed hospitals and ambulance companies and recruited 20,000 registered nurses to serve in the military. The Red Cross also pioneered the field of psychiatric nurses and worked to improve artificial limbs. The influenza epidemic of 1918 increased the demand for women nurses. And just as Civil War nurses faced disease and death on a daily basis, so did nurses serving in World War I. During the war, 296 Red Cross nurses and 127 American Red Cross ambulance drivers died in the line of duty. And the propaganda posters of the time portrayed nurses as angels of mercy. During the Civil War, people rationed out of necessity. During World War I, it was viewed as a patriotic endeavor. And this is just one of the many propaganda posters focusing on rationing. You often see food symbolized by a loaf of bread, equating to the nation's ability to win the war. In 1917, newly appointed director of the United States Food Administration, Herbert Hoover, launched the Food Will Win the War campaign, encouraging voluntary food conservation. And this poster is targeting people in the United States, immigrants who have family ties overseas, reminding them that their families back home also depend on American agriculture. Liberty bonds were extremely important to the American war effort, and women flocked to these opportunities as well. The first drive in May 1917 used 11,000 billboards and streetcar ads in 3,200 cities. All were donated. During the second drive, 60,000 women were recruited to sell bonds, and this volunteer army of women stationed themselves at factory gates to distribute 7 million flyers on Liberty Day. Mail order houses of Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck mailed 2,000 inserts to farm women, and enthusiastic librarians inserted 4.5 million library loan reminder cards in public library books in 1,500 libraries. More than 12,000 women served in the Navy and the Marine Corps in clerical positions, naval intelligence, and as recruiters. Several thousand others held positions in the U.S. Army. Working under combat conditions in France, 223 hello girls, bilingual telephone and switchboard operators employed by the U.S. Signal Corps supported communications between Allied forces. World War I and the Progressive Era ushered in two significant achievements for women on the national and international stages. Although full female enfranchisement gained traction prior to World War I, the contributions of women in the factory, in the field, and in the hospital proved their capabilities to participate as full-fledged members of society beyond the shadow of a doubt. Less than a year after World War I, Congress passed the 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. And on August 24th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment, officially granting the women the right to vote. So we see a culmination of the contributions of women from the Civil War to World War I with that vote in 1920. Thank you.
Very good.
Any questions?
So, Krista, do you think, was this movement, before our entry into the war, do you think this movement was moving anyway, and the war just precipitated something, or do you think?
Yeah, I think it accelerated it, definitely. Whereas the Civil War kind of hampered women's movement forward, I think World War I definitely accelerated it.
What about the Spanish-American War and some of the ones between there? Where women obviously participated there as well?
Yeah, largely in the capacities of, sewing, knitting, gathering supplies. Honestly, I haven't really looked into the volunteerism beyond that. I'm not sure if any actually deployed to the battlefronts.
Other question is that it would appear that World War I set the stage for the home front, Rosie the Riveters and everything, but that doesn't seem to get the play that World War II does.
Exactly. Yeah, when I started this research, I was really surprised all of the different roles that women held during that time. And I purposely left out World War II just for the sake of time, and also because by that point women had the right to vote for several years.
You were mentioning ambulance drivers. In this country, was it, when did women become ambulance drivers and attendants? Was it around World War I?
That's
I have a reason for asking this.
I'm really not sure.
There is a picture, I volunteer in the archives here once in a while, and there's a picture in the collection here that was made in Nashville, I think around General Hospital, sometime around World War I, that shows two women posing next to an ambulance, one in front and then the other one behind the wheel. And it's a really compelling photo that I couldn't find any caption to go along with it. So I've been trying to research that, but was that?
I mean, that would, I don't know for sure, but that would certainly make sense because they definitely had more opportunities at home to serve in these roles than overseas.
So that wouldn't have been that unusual during World War I necessarily.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that way.
And then one other question. You mentioned the Liberty Day. Was that a specific day?
Yeah, it was a specific bond drive day.
Is that like in 1918? Sorry. I don't know if it was one date or more than one date.
Yeah, I for some reason didn't put a date in here. I'll have to check on that one.
Can I say that, give you a plug?
Sure.
Our Bellevue History and Genealogy group, which has been meeting every Friday since September 2006, except for January and July, is starting up again this Friday. Tim Walker's going to be our presenter. On September 15th, Krista is going to give an extended version of this, and we look forward to that. We also got, we're really focusing kind of on World War I, this period, because we have Greg Biggs who's going to be talking about the Cumberland River as an avenue through the wars and commerce. And then also we have a new fella to town, Jesse Williams, who's the curator at the Belmead Plantation. And he's going to be talking about Belmead Plantation in World War I prior to the establishment of Warner Parks. And he's going to, I know from his presentation, bring up some things that the Belmead Plantation was doing in Victory Garden type presentation towards,
That's great.
towards that. So, but we thank you for your agreement to talk to our group.
Yeah, anytime. No other questions?
One, I came in late. Are you planning on doing a book, or has someone done a book about this? It's very interesting.
I mean, I definitely consulted several books. I'm not aware of a book comparing the roles of the Civil War and World War I.
You make a great topic.
Yeah. I haven't planned to do one. This kind of has evolved from a research paper that I wrote on the roles of women in occupied Nashville in graduate school. So it's been evolving from there ever since. Yes?
Did you see any discrepancies in the roles of women across like race or class lines? Like, did women did their like status or race determine how they served, or in what capacity they served?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, especially during the Civil War, that was a large factor when it came to pay and also job opportunities. African American women were given more, they would serve as laborers on fortifications, whereas we just don't see that with white women. And it seems that at least, the images and things that I found for World War I, it seems that they were still very much segregated from each other. Well, thank you again. You're welcome.
Just want to let you guys know next month we're having Chuck Sherrill from the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and his presentation is Collecting the Past, What's New at the State Library and Archives.